The night of my wedding reception, my husband gave a toast in front of 148 people that had absolutely nothing to do with love. It had to do with wire transfers. 38 of them, totaling $94,660. Every cent of it from the trust my grandfather left specifically for me. And while the whole room went dead silent, my sister was somewhere over the Atlantic filming herself for TikTok. I'm going to tell you exactly how we got there, because honestly, the story doesn't make sense unless you understand who I was before that night and who I became somewhere in between. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and I want to be clear, it was a good childhood. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Dad sold real estate, Mom managed the household, and did part-time bookkeeping for a couple of small businesses. And we lived in a nice 4-bedroom in Brentwood with a finished basement and a trampoline in the backyard. My grandfather on my mother's side, Grandpa Roy, was a quiet, practical man who'd built a small contracting business from nothing, saved carefully his whole life, and believed that women in his family should have what he called "quote_0_." He never got fancy with that phrase. He just meant money that's yours, not anyone else's, so you never have to ask permission for your own life. When he died, he left me a trust worth $97,000. I was 22. My dad, Gary, was named co-trustee alongside a trust attorney named David Holt, which at the time felt like exactly what it was, my dad helping manage paperwork. I didn't think twice about it. He was my dad. The other thing you need to understand is my sister Brittany. She's 8 years younger than me, which means by the time she was discovering herself, I was already out of the house, and she had our parents' complete and undivided attention. Brittany is, and I say this as flatly and accurately as I can, extraordinarily good at being the center of things. She's pretty in a very particular way. Highlighted blonde, great skin, the kind of expressive face that reads well on camera. She started posting travel content in her early 20s, and it genuinely took off. By the time all of this happened, she had around 290,000 followers on TikTok, and real brand deals, like actual contracts with actual money. I was proud of her for that part. I want to say that clearly. Building something from nothing is hard, and she did it. What I didn't know, what none of us knew except the two people who were supposed to be looking out for me, was how she was funding the aesthetic that made it all look effortless. Evan came into my life about 3.5 years before the wedding. We met at a work event, which sounds boring, but honestly was kind of perfect, because we're both kind of boring in the best way. He's a financial analyst at an insurance company, the type of person who color codes his Excel spreadsheets, not because he has to, but because he genuinely finds it satisfying. First date was coffee, then dinner, then a long walk around Centennial Park, where he told me he thought most people were too comfortable with uncertainty, and I said I completely agreed. And we both laughed, because neither of us had ever said that out loud to someone who actually understood what we meant. He met my family about 4 months in. I remember that dinner so clearly. Mom made pot roast. Brittany was in Bali at the time, but her name still came up about 17 times because Dad spent most of the meal showing Evan her TikTok videos on his phone. Evan was gracious about it. He looked at me once, across the table, with this expression that was equal parts amused and, I don't know, careful, like he was filing something away. We got engaged 18 months later, and we started planning the wedding immediately because that's just who we are. We had a venue booked, a caterer, a florist, invitations sent. 2.5 years of planning. Everything was in place. And then, 5 weeks before the wedding, my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, very carefully, that she wanted to just float something by me. I was at my desk at the nonprofit where I work. I'm a project coordinator, which basically means I'm the person who makes sure everyone else's chaos has a schedule. And I remember I was eating a granola bar and looking out the window at the parking lot, and Mom's voice had that particular soft tone that always meant she'd already decided something and was now performing the part where she asked. She said, I waited. I put the granola bar down. I said, she said, There was a pause. I said, Mom was quiet for a second, and then she said, and we said goodbye, and I sat there staring at the parking lot for a long time after. The calls escalated from there. She called every day for a week, sometimes twice. Each time it was a variation on the same theme, just from a slightly different angle. Once it was about how this brand deal could quote, 15 __. Once it was about how Grandpa Roy, quote, 16 __. Once you tried the health angle, Dad had been a little run down lately, and wasn't it stressful for him with everything going on? I held the line every single time, but it started to cost something. Evan watched me take those calls. He'd sit across the room and wait, and after I hung up, he'd ask, "How was it?" And I'd say, quote, 18, and he'd say, "Okay," and neither of us would say what we were both thinking. Then Dad sent an email. It was 3 paragraphs long and opened with, "We hope you understand what it means to be a family." He talked about sacrifice. He talked about how Brittany was working so hard to build something real and needed their support. He said, and I still have this email, it is saved in a folder, "Your grandfather always said family comes first. I think you know what he would want here." That was a particular kind of low blow, and I think he knew it. I didn't respond for 2 days. When I did, I said, "The wedding is on the date it's on. I love you. I hope you'll be there." They never formally RSVP'd. Their 2 seats at the head table stayed empty on a seating chart I'd spent 6 hours on. Brittany posted a story about a week after the calls started. She didn't name anyone. She didn't have to. It was just a video of her looking out an airplane window at golden hour light, and the text overlay said, quote, 22. It got 40,000 likes in about 18 hours. People in the comments were saying things like, quote, 23 and, quote, 24, and I sat there reading them and felt something go very still inside me. Not rage exactly. More like the moment when you're looking at a picture that seems abstract and then suddenly the image snaps into focus and you can't unsee it. I showed Evan. He looked at the screen for a long moment and then handed my phone back and said, quote, 25, quote, 26, quote, I said, quote, 27, quote. He nodded once and went back to whatever he was doing, and that was the whole conversation. My parents didn't come to the wedding. I want to say I was surprised, but I wasn't, not really. I was hoping they would, the way you hope for something you already know isn't going to happen. The morning of the ceremony, I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting a text. Nothing came. We got married on a Saturday in early October at a venue outside Nashville. Exposed brick, string lights, the kind of place that looks like a Pinterest board, but in the absolute best way. Evan cried a little when I walked in, which made me cry, which made my maid of honor cry, which, honestly, set a tone for the whole evening. The reception was everything we'd planned. Good food, good music, people we actually loved in the room. I danced with my uncle instead of my dad. I made my own toast, and it was funny and warm, and I meant every word. For most of that night, I was genuinely, fully happy. Whatever was waiting on the other side of it hadn't arrived yet. If you're enjoying this journey, tap subscribe and share in the comments where you're watching from and the time there right now. I read each one. Thank you for being part of this. We did a 10-day honeymoon, Costa Rica. Nothing fancy, lots of hiking and bad sunburns, and one truly terrible ziplining incident that I'm still not ready to talk about. And came back to our apartment in the Germantown neighborhood of Nashville with 2 weeks of mail piled up and the particular exhausted satisfaction of people who have survived the biggest logistical event of their lives. We unpacked, we did laundry, I went back to work. Evan went back to work. We settled into being married, which felt remarkably similar to being engaged, except we introduced each other differently. About 2.5 weeks after we got home, I was at the kitchen table sorting through the mail. Bills, a couple of late wedding gifts, a dentist reminder, the usual, and Evan came in from the living room with his laptop open. He sat down across from me, and he had a specific look on his face that I'd seen before. Not worried, exactly. More like he was holding something carefully. "Hey," he said. "So, this is probably nothing, but..." He turned the laptop around. "I was pulling the trust account info for the tax documents. Just routine." He said it flatly. "Okay," I said. He pointed at the screen. "This is the current balance." I looked at the number. $2,340. I looked at it again. Then I looked up at him. "That's wrong," I said. "I thought so too," he said, "but I pulled the statement history and it's not a banking error." He paused. "Nat, 38 withdrawals over the last 19 months. The account's been almost completely drained." I remember I had a mug of tea in my hands. I set it down on the table very carefully, like I was afraid of something, and then I just sat there. The tea went cold before I ever took a sip. My brain did that thing it does when information is too large. It just kind of circled around the edges, testing it, trying to find a smaller interpretation that made more sense. "Maybe there was a fee structure I didn't know about," I said. "No," Evan said. "The fees don't add up to anything close to this. These are wire transfers, 38 of them. The smallest is $650. The largest is $8,900. He was quiet for a second. "I called David Holt's office this morning. I'm waiting for them to pull the full transaction history." I didn't say anything. He closed the laptop halfway and then opened it again, which he does when he's thinking through something he doesn't want to say out loud. "Quote 41, he said finally. I nodded. "Quote 42, I said. "Quote 43. Neither of us said the next part for a while. The full transaction history came through 2 days later. Evan printed it out, all 12 pages of it, and we sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with coffee getting cold beside us and went through every line. 38 transactions over 19 months. The payment descriptions included things like quote 44, quote 45, quote 46, quote, and one, just one, which in retrospect was almost impressively careless, that said quote 47, quote. Evan circled that one with a red pen and didn't say anything for a moment. "He didn't even bother to change the description," I said. "No," Evan said, "he didn't." I stared at that line for a long time. I kept thinking, why wouldn't you at least type something vague? Why just write her name and the country? It was like he'd gotten so comfortable with the idea that I would never look that it didn't even occur to him to cover it. That thought made me feel something I don't have a great word for. Colder than anger, maybe. More clarifying. There was a payment listed as a consulting fee, routed through an LLC with my dad's initials that I hadn't known existed. Evan had cross-referenced it. "He paid himself," Evan said, his voice very level. "There's an LLC in Gary's name that received 2 of these transfers, $3,000 and change total. So he took a cut for managing the account." I didn't respond. I just kept staring at the paper. Later that afternoon, I called my mother. She picked up on the 3rd ring and said, quote, 54, quote, in this careful way that told me she already knew what this was about. Quote, 55, quote, I said. Quote, 56, quote. There was a pause. Not a surprised pause, a waiting pause, the kind that people take when they've rehearsed what comes next. "Your father was just managing things the best way he knew how," she said finally. "Brittany needed Mom. She had real opportunities that required investment. And the language in the trust, Mom, stop talking." I heard her breathe. He took $94,000 from my account. Over a year and a half, 38 separate transactions for Brittany's brand trips and equipment and flights. "It wasn't like that," she said, and her voice shifted to something softer, more careful. "Your grandfather would have wanted the family—" "Don't," I said. "Don't use him for this." There was silence. Then she said, "Natalie, you're married now. You have Evan. You have stability. Brittany is building something real, and she needed the support." I took a breath. I heard myself say very quietly, "I'm going to need you to not call me for a while." And I hung up. Gary called about an hour later. I let it go to voicemail and then listened to it standing in our hallway. His voice was the one he used for difficult conversations, businesslike, reasonable. The voice he probably used when a real estate deal was going south and he needed to manage it. Natalie, I know you're upset. I want you to understand that the trust documents had language about family benefit, and I was operating in good faith within those parameters. Your grandfather wanted the family to thrive. I think if you take a beat and look at the bigger picture, you'll understand that this wasn't done with any bad intention. I listened to the whole thing, and then I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and walked into the living room and sat on the couch in the dark for about 20 minutes without moving. Evan came and sat next to me. He didn't say anything. After a while, I said, quote 70. Evan nodded. Quote 71, he said. Quote 72, quote 73, I said. Quote 74. We went to see the trust attorney, David Holt, the following Thursday. He was a trim man in his early 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the particular manner of someone who has delivered bad news often enough to have gotten good at keeping his face neutral. He'd already reviewed the transaction history by the time we got there. He was quiet for a moment after we sat down, and then he said, I want to be direct with you about what I'm looking at. He folded his hands on the desk. The trust document does include language about benefit of the family, and Gary's attorney is going to use that. They're going to argue that supporting a family member constitutes valid distribution. He paused. However, the intent of the document is clear. Your grandfather established this fund specifically in your name for your individual use. There was no ambiguity about that in his communications, and any court is going to look at 38 transactions routed to what are essentially operating expenses for your sister's social media business and conclude that this was not what the trust was designed for. Evan was writing in a small notebook he'd brought. Quote, 78, quote, he asked. Quote, 79, quote, David said. Quote, 80, quote, I heard myself ask. Quote, 81, quote. Quote, 82, quote, David said. Quote, 83, quote, I nodded. I said, he looked at me carefully, he said. I said, we drove home in near silence. I remember sitting in the parking lot of David's building for about 5 extra minutes after Evan started the car, just looking through the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of us. Not crying, just sitting. The sky outside was that particular flat gray that Nashville gets in late October. Not dramatic, just overcast, like the weather couldn't be bothered to perform. Evan said. I looked at him. I said. Evan didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. After another minute, I said, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 93, underscore, underscore. He put the car in drive. Here's the thing about the nights that followed. They were quiet in a way that felt like something was being dismantled very carefully. I went to work, I came home, I made dinner, I talked to Evan. Brittany posted from Marrakesh. Beautiful shots, perfect golden light, a riad with blue tile walls that I knew now had been funded in part by my grandfather's money for my independent footing. I looked at the photos for a long time one night, and then I put my phone down and I didn't look at her account again. Somewhere in that same week, I was going through a box I hadn't unpacked since the move. Old stuff, the kind you carry from apartment to apartment because you can never make yourself deal with it. And at the bottom, in a small metal tin that had once held Danish butter cookies, I found an envelope. My name on the front and Grandpa Roy's handwriting. Inside was a folded piece of paper. 3 paragraphs, handwritten. He talked about watching me grow up. He said I had always been the one who held things together quietly, and that he was sorry the world didn't always notice that. He said he was leaving me the trust because he wanted me to have options. And then the last line, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 94, underscore, underscore. I sat on the floor of our bedroom with that letter for a long time. I didn't cry, which surprised me. What I felt was something closer to clarity, like a sound you've been half hearing for years suddenly becoming distinct. I took a photo of the letter with my phone. I emailed it to David Holt with a single word, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 95, underscore, underscore. He responded within the hour, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 96, underscore, underscore. Evan had been working on something in the evenings. I knew he was doing it. I'd see the laptop open after dinner, spreadsheets, documents. But I hadn't asked, partly because I trusted him, and partly because I didn't want to see it before I was ready. About a week before the wedding reception, we'd pushed it back to accommodate guests who couldn't make the ceremony weekend, a small blessing in retrospect. He sat down next to me on the couch and said, "I want to show you something." He opened the laptop. It was a presentation, 11 slides, clean, clear, the kind of document Evan makes when he wants something to be completely, indisputably, unambiguously understood. The first few slides were the trust document itself, the language, the intent, Grandpa Roy's stated purpose. Then the transaction history, dates, amounts, descriptions, a slide that mapped each withdrawal to a corresponding Brittany content post. The Portugal reel matched to a payment dated 4 days earlier. Then the screenshot. I'd almost forgotten about it. A text exchange between my mother and my father that had been produced in the initial document request, buried in the correspondence file. Evan zoomed in. My mother's text, sent the week before the wedding, read, quote, 98. I stared at that for a long time. Quote, 99, I asked. Quote, 100, Evan said. Quote, 101. I looked at him. Quote, 102. He held my gaze. Quote, 103, he said. I was quiet. Then I said, quote, 104. He turned back to the laptop and pulled up the guest list. He highlighted 2 names. One was a marketing director from a tourism brand. He'd come as a professional acquaintance of Evan's, knew Brittany tangentially. The other was a regional PR contact who'd helped broker her last 2 brand deals. Both had confirmed attendance. Evan, I said. He looked at me. They're going to see everything. Yes, he said, they are. I didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, he closed the laptop, he said, and I did. The reception was at the same venue as the ceremony. We'd combined them to save costs. And by 6 o'clock on a Saturday, it was warm with people, the string lights doing exactly what string lights are supposed to do, 2 bars open, the band playing something low and easy while guests found their tables. 148 people. I wore the dress I'd chosen 14 months earlier, ivory with a low back, and my hair was in a low bun my best friend Kayla had spent 45 minutes on. I remember standing near the entrance and watching the room fill up and thinking, they're not here. My parents are not in this room. That was a particular kind of grief that I'd mostly set down by that point, but in moments it came back, and this was one of them. And then I looked across the room and saw Evan talking to the sound tech, and I felt it pass. He was calm in a way that was somehow louder than any noise in the room. Toasts happened around 7:30. Our best man went first, then Kayla, both of them perfect. Then Evan took the microphone. He thanked people for coming. He said a few things about me that made my eyes sting. And then he said, I want to share something with everyone tonight because I think the people in this room deserve to know what kind of person Natalie is and what she's dealt with to get here. The projector, which had been used for a photo slideshow earlier, flickered on. The first slide was the trust document. I watched the room shift, people straightening slightly, heads tilting. Natalie's grandfather left her a trust when she was 22, Evan said, his voice even and clear. $97,000. He wrote her a letter with it. He said it was hers, no one else's. He clicked to the next slide. Transaction history. Dates running down the left margin like a column of small accusations. 38 withdrawals over 19 months. $94,660. Every cent of it gone before Natalie even knew to look. By the 3rd slide, the room was very quiet, the kind of quiet where you could hear glasses being set down. By the 8th slide, the screenshot, my mother's message, the words underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 115__, filling the screen. I heard someone at a table near the back make a sharp, involuntary sound. The marketing director from the tourism brand was sitting at a table by the window. I watched him look at his phone and then back at the screen. He didn't move. Someone near the center of the room had their phone up, filming. I saw the light of it. Evan said, "Natalie didn't get to have her father walk her down the aisle. Her parents didn't come. They chose not to be here. And now you know why they might have been uncomfortable showing up." He looked at me. He set the microphone on the table beside him, gently, like he was putting down something he'd been carrying a long time. And then he walked back to our table and sat down next to me and took my hand. The room was still quiet. Then, slowly, I stood up. I don't know exactly what I'd planned to say. I walked to the microphone and picked it up, and I looked out at all those faces, people I'd known for years, people I'd just met, people who would go home tonight and tell this story to someone. And I found the phone that was still recording in the middle of the room, the little light steady. I thought about Morocco. I thought about golden light on blue tile, funded by my grandfather's careful savings, posted without a second thought. I thought about my mother's text message. I thought about the word __quote _117__. And then I said, clearly, into the microphone, looking right at that little light, __quote _118__. I set the microphone down, and I walked back to my husband. The video was on Reddit by 10 that night. By morning, it was on TikTok, which, I will admit, has a particular poetry to it. The clip was about 4 minutes long, and it had been edited slightly to cut between the slides and my face and Evan's voice, and then the final line. The comments were not kind to my family. By the time I woke up Sunday morning, it had been viewed over 2 million times. My phone was so full of notifications from people I barely knew that I turned it face down and left it there while I made breakfast. Evan made coffee. We sat in the kitchen in our pajamas in the morning light, and I said, "Well?" And he said, "Yeah." And we ate toast. 7 months later, Gary and Linda settled the civil suit. The terms included repayment of the original trust, plus damages, plus legal fees. The final figure was $178,000. Gary also had to step down as co-trustee from a separate family account related to my mother's estate planning, and the settlement included a clause that prevented him from serving in any trustee or fiduciary role going forward. 2 of his long-standing real estate business partners quietly ended their professional relationships with him in the weeks after the video circulated. One larger commercial client, a developer he'd worked with for almost a decade, issued a short public statement saying they had decided to pursue other representation. His real estate reputation in the Nashville market, which had been his whole identity for 30 years, took a hit that I don't think is fully recoverable. I don't feel good about that, and I don't feel bad about it either. I feel the way I imagine you feel when a consequence arrives that was always going to arrive. Not satisfaction. Exactly. Something more like recognition. Brittany lost 61,000 followers in the 10 days after the video went viral. The tourism brand that had hired her for the Portugal and Morocco campaign, the same one that had been the reason my parents gave for why I should move my wedding, terminated her contract without compensation, citing a clause about brand reputation. She posted a video responding to __quote _122__, which got ratioed badly, and then went quiet for several weeks. When she came back, she was posting from what looked like her old apartment in Atlanta, and the production quality had dropped noticeably. No ring light, natural window light, the kind you can't control. I watched one of those videos for about 30 seconds, not out of cruelty, just, I don't know, curiosity maybe. She didn't look like herself, which made me feel something complicated that I'm still working out. She has never contacted me. I have not contacted her. I don't expect that to change. My mother sent an email 6 months after the settlement. It was long and careful and talked about how painful everything had been for the family and how she hoped someday we could find a path to healing. She didn't apologize for what they did. She apologized for how things went. I read it twice and then filed it in the same folder as my father's email from before the wedding, and I haven't opened that folder since. My dad has not reached out at all. I think for him, the silence is the only position that doesn't require him to say something he's not capable of saying. And in a strange way, I understand that better than the email. Neither of them is in my life right now, and I don't know what the future holds. But I know that whatever it holds will happen on terms that I set. That part feels new. That part, honestly, feels good. Evan and I bought a house in the spring. It's in a suburb of Nashville about 20 minutes out. A little more square footage than we strictly needed, a backyard with an actual yard, a second bedroom that we're not calling anything specific yet, but we both know what it's for. We closed on a Thursday and spent the first weekend moving boxes. On Saturday afternoon, I was unpacking a box from the bedroom closet, more of that accumulated life stuff that follows you from move to move. And near the bottom, I found the letter, Grandpa Roy's letter. The handwriting, the 3 careful paragraphs, the last line. I'd had it framed after everything settled, a plain dark wood frame, nothing fancy, the kind he would have approved of. I stood there holding it for a moment in the half-unpacked room, boxes everywhere, afternoon light coming through the window that didn't have curtains yet. And then I went to the wall and I hung it. First thing on any wall in the new house. It went up crooked on the first try, and I fixed it, and then it was straight, and I stepped back and looked at it for a while. He always knew who I was, even when I forgot. Turns out that was worth a lot more than $97,000.